This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for November 20th through the 26th. On this week's show, a TV show that helped shape music for the 90s premieres unceremoniously. Two Christmas classics are born, a controversial song for its time hit number one on the singles chart, and we remember the life of a vocal legend who passed away this week in music history. In the 1980s, MTV had been firmly established as a cultural force. As the 90s started, what it didn't know was that it was going to continue to influence music by riding two different waves. The first was the sound that was bursting onto the music scene known as the Seattle sound, then simply referred to as grunge music. The second was a folk rock nostalgia alternative rock movement by acts such as Sinead O'Connor, REM, Suzanne Vega, Michael Penn, Toad the Wet Sprocket, Tonic, Travis, and many, many others. A couple producers got it in their heads that they wanted to do an acoustic concert series with an intimate audience. That idea was absolutely nothing new. Elvis Presley pulled that off in his 1968 comeback special. The producers figured that it would work now because of the new wave of alt-rock artists like REM who were suddenly getting popular in the mainstream, and especially after the reception that John Bon Jovi and Richie Sambora received after doing an acoustic set during a time gap at the 1989 MTV Video Music Awards. On November 26, 1989, MTV Unplugged premiered with very little fanfare, as the network really didn't promote it. As evidence, the first episode had the group Squeeze, a group which by that point had passed their prime in terms of popularity. The show was given 13 episodes, with songwriter Jules Shear hosting. The first shows featured Sinead O'Connor, Aerosmith, Elton John, and Stevie Ray Vaughan. What made Unplugged take hold and become a destination for artists who wanted to prove themselves as musicians was when Paul McCartney did an episode. He then released the episode onto CD, called it Unplugged, the official bootleg, and after that CD became popular, Unplugged was off and running. Soon, other artists wanted to do an episode and release it. Memorable episodes include the granddaddy of Unplugged music, Bob Dylan. Also, the Rap Unplugged edition with Moni Love, De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, and LL Cool J. Episodes with Queensryche, Midnight Oil, Roxette, Oasis, Stone Temple Pilots, and Pearl Jam were pretty popular. And the original lineup of Kiss reunited for their Unplugged with that year's current lineup of Kiss as well. Some artists released their appearances onto CD and sold millions of copies, along with winning Grammy Awards for them. Among those were Mariah Carey, Nirvana, Eric Clapton, Tony Bennett, Alice in Chains, Rod Stewart, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, The Eagles, 10,000 Maniacs, and Bryan Adams. The show became such a big moneymaker for artists that even Bruce Springsteen was going to do the show Unplugged, decided to plug in, and they released a CD from that show and just called it Springsteen Plugged, and it sold millions of copies. Although its heyday was in the 1990s, the show does manage to show up every now and then, though not as popular as it once was. That's probably more to the testament about how far MTV has fallen in the musical consciousness of the millennial and Gen Z generations. Hopefully, though, the programmers at the network will get it and Unplugged back to prominence. The MTV Unplugged television series premiered on November 26th, 1991. Next, you know Dasher and Dancer and Donner and Blitzen, etc., etc., but do you know how a reindeer who was laughed at for his perceived handicap became a Christmas classic? It all started back in the late 1930s as, of course, a marketing gimmick. During the Great Depression, the Chicago-based department store Montgomery Ward gave away coloring books to kids as a way to get their parents into the store. They finally figured out that maybe if they created something more organic, or at least in-house, it would save them a ton of money. They gave the job of creating something new to a guy by the name of Robert L. May. Robert came up with the story about a reindeer with a bright red nose who was made fun of and bullied by even Santa Claus until that one fateful night when Santa needed his help. Robert tried out the names Reginald the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Rollo the Red-Nosed Reindeer until he settled on Rudolph. You know, honestly, if I were Rudolph, I would have told Santa to go keep it clean. Family show. Moving on. The book was a huge hit locally. They came up with a catchy song to go with it, penned by a pianist by the name of Opie Gunther. Yes, his name was Opie. Don't make fun of it. It wasn't until the late 1940s that both the book and the song became national treasures. The book had its first national rollout in 1947. Then they turned it into a short theatrical cartoon in 1948. The song itself was recorded by the legendary singer and actor Mr. Gene Autry. On November 25th, 1949, his version of the song entered the Billboard pop charts. It went on to become one of the biggest-selling holiday singles of all time, sitting right behind Bing Crosby's Christmas classic White Christmas until the 1980s, when Band-Aid's holiday classic Do They Know It's Christmas took over that spot. What cemented the song and the character in the heads of boomers, Gen Xers, and maybe even millennials was the Rankin Bass TV claymation version of the song. Personally, I still think the whole thing sets a bad example for kids, because it tells them that people are going to make fun of you because you're different, and then when they need you, they're going to be your bestest buddy and come running back begging you to help them. Yo, Santa, now you need my help? What, I wasn't good enough for you before because you spent way too much money on those grande-sized meals? Couldn't get a decent set of headlights for that sleigh of yours, so now you need me? You know what, Santa? You can go... Be cool. Be cool, Leslie. Be cool. Still a bad example for the kids, I'm just saying. Anyway... The song, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, as sung by the iconic Mr. Gene Autry, entered the Billboard Hot 100 Singles Chart on November 25th, 1949. Before we go any further, we'd like to tell you about our other podcasts. The Music History Today podcast goes over the daily events in music history and drops daily, including weekends, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. There's also the Music Halls of Fame podcast, which talks about a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with other Music Halls of Fame's museums and walks of fame. The Music Halls of Fame podcast drops every Thursday and can also be found on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to this podcast. Olivia Newton-John was born in England in 1948 but moved to Australia when she was young. Her lineage is actually rather impressive. One of her grandfathers fled Hitler's Germany and won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Her great-grandfather and great-great-grandfathers were both judges. Her father worked for England's MI5 and was one of the people who apprehended Nazi Rudolf Hess. Olivia's career started when she was 14 years old when she was in a girl group. It didn't last too long, but it did get her spots on television shows and also connections, including meeting future friend and collaborator Pat Carroll. During one of those shows, Olivia won a trip to England to record, which she actually didn't want to go, but was eventually talked into going by her mother. She was actually pretty lonely. She missed her boyfriend and tried to come back to Australia a few times, but her mother thwarted those plans, determined that her daughter was going to try and see things through and probably to also keep her away from that boyfriend. You know how mothers can get sometimes. It helped for a while that Pat Carroll moved to England on a work visa. Olivia worked with famed producer Don Kirshner for a time in a group called Tomorrow, but that group didn't actually gain much traction. In 1971, Olivia recorded her debut album, If Not For You. The title track was a big hit for her internationally, and while other songs on that album became big hits overseas, they weren't big in America. She broke through in America, though, in 1973 with the song Let Me Be There, which went top 5 in 3 different Billboard charts, including the country music chart. She also was nominated for and won the Grammy Award for Best Country Single by a Female for the song. Olivia ended up representing England in the Eurovision Song Contest, but lost that year to ABBA's Waterloo. She did end up getting an album deal with EMI Records from it, which proved fortuitous. The album If You Love Me, Let Me Know had the title track go top 5 on the Top 100 Singles chart and also on the country chart. The next song, I Honestly Love You, also became a huge hit and won her 2 Grammy Awards, including Record of the Year. At this point, Olivia started to receive some backlash from the country music community, who didn't like the fact that someone who wasn't from America was finding success in their genre and winning their major awards on top of all of it. It got to the point where other artists like Dolly Parton's sister had to actually defend her. It also led to her moving to America in order to record her next album, Have You Ever Been Mellow? The title track was a huge hit, as was the next single, Please Mr. Please. Her string of hits cooled off, but not for long. During this period, she did her own television show, and then Hollywood came calling. Olivia starred in the movie version of the Broadway musical Grease. The film not only became a huge hit, but the soundtrack became one of the biggest selling soundtracks of all time. As far as Olivia's contributions to the soundtrack, she got 3 top 5 songs out of it. You're the One That I Want and Summer Nights, both with co-star John Travolta, and Hopelessly Devoted to You. As the 1980s rolled around, Olivia began to tire of her good girl image and decided to make it sexier and more mature. She starred in the movie Xanadu, which didn't do too well, but the soundtrack did really well, giving her the hits Xanadu, Magic, and Suddenly. On one album's back cover from the 80s, she put a photo of herself taken from behind with herself topless, wearing tight equestrian horse riding pants and holding a riding crop. Well, that was subtle. And then there was this #1 smash single that got her into a lot of trouble at the time. The song Physical was the first song released off the album of the same name. The song was written by Steve Kipner and Terry Shattuck. It was originally supposed to be sung by a man, specifically Rod Stewart, due to its suggestive lyrics such as, quote, "There's nothing left to talk about unless it's horizontally," end quote. Tina Turner was also offered the song, but she turned it down. Olivia was offered the song after that. Initially, she also turned it down because she thought that although she was trying to get a more mature sound, this song might be pushing it a little too much. She eventually agreed to doing it, though. Olivia recorded the song in January 1981. Fun fact for you, the guitar solo on the song was performed by Steve Lukather of the band Toto. Physical was released on September 28, 1981. On November 21st, 1981, the song hit #1 on the Billboard Singles Chart, and it stayed #1 for 10 straight weeks, which was the longest stretch at #1 for any song during the 1980s. It was also a top 10 single in 10 other countries, hitting #1 in 5 of them, including in her native Australia. In America, it was the #1 song of 1982 and the #1 song of the 80s, beating out huge hits from artists such as Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, U2, Duran Duran, and Wham! It was also the 10th biggest song of the 20th century and the second biggest song of the 20th century by a female solo artist. Although the song was nominated for a Grammy Award, both the song and the music video that went with it were extremely controversial for slightly different reasons. The song itself was censored and, on some radio stations, completely banned for its lyrics. The now iconic music video stirred up controversy for, among other things, Olivia rubbing up against men while wearing a tight leotard, and for 2 men holding hands. Remember, this was the early 1980s, kids. Ronald Reagan was just beginning his presidency, and conservatism was beginning to take hold of the country. The moral majority, mega churches, all that sort of good stuff. To see the woman known for innocent country pop songs acting suggestively was scandalous, especially when a suggestive gay scene with two men holding hands showed up in the music video as well. Physical turned out to be Olivia's last #1 single on the Top 100 Singles Chart, although she had a #1 song on the dance chart much later. Her singing career cooled off again in the mid-1980s as other endeavors took over. She became an entrepreneur with her friend Pat Carroll, became a UNICEF spokesperson, a wildlife advocate, and a cancer spokesperson, having fought a battle with breast cancer. She acted occasionally, including on the TV show Glee, along with being a guest judge on RuPaul's Drag Race. She also had a #1 hit on the Billboard Dance Chart in 2015 that I mentioned a minute ago, when a dance version of her song Magic, this time as a duet with her daughter Chloe, hit the top of the charts, giving her a rarity of having a mother-daughter chart-topping song. Olivia had 2 #1 albums, 5 #1 singles, and 4 Grammy Award wins. She sold over 100 million records worldwide, making her one of the biggest-selling artists of all time. Olivia Newton-John unfortunately passed away from breast cancer, having had that taken hold yet again, on August 8, 2022 at the age of 73. Olivia Newton-John's smash hit single Physical hit #1 on the Billboard's Hot 100 Singles Chart and stayed there for 10 straight weeks, starting on November 21st, 1981. Now, here's another Christmas classic for you, and it's an 80s song this time, only it is not your ordinary 80s song. In fact, this one started a charity trend. Both it and the concert that it inspired have stood the test of time and have become a timeline marker of sorts for Generation X. How did it get to that point, though? Well, what we're going to do is go back, way back into time. Actually, okay, we're only going back to the mid-1980s, when a journalist did a story that planted a seed that made all the difference. Starting in 1983, journalist Michael Bjork was reporting on a famine in the country of Ethiopia for BBC News. The famine was part of the Ethiopian civil war that had been going on since Ethiopian head of state Mengistu Haile Mariam seized power in 1978 until he finally was overthrown in 1991. On October 23, 1984, the BBC put one of Michael's reports on the air that struck a chord worldwide. It was about a nurse for one of the relief agencies named Claire Bertschinger. Her unenviable task was to help decide which, out of over 85,000 people at a refugee camp, would get the aid that they gave that day. It was her job to put marks on children who would receive the aid that day and who would live, while the vast majority would not get any marks and would soon die. A 1984 diary entry that she made while she was stationed at a feeding station said, quote, "There are thousands of people outside. I have counted 10 rows, and each row has more than 100 people in, and I can only take 60 to 70 children today, but they all need to come in." End quote. It traumatized her so much that she didn't talk about it for over 20 years, finally saying in an interview, quote, "I felt like a Nazi sending people to the death camps. Why was I in this situation? Why was it possible in this time of plenty that some have food and some do not? It is not right." End quote. For her part, Claire retired in 2024 from nursing. Michael Bjork's report about Claire and the famine moved the British public so much that people started giving tons of money to organizations like Save the Children. The report was also shown in America, which was unheard of back in the 1980s. The report also moved one man into action. Back in the early 1980s, Bob Geldof was known for being the lead singer of the group the Boomtown Rats. Their big hit at the time was the song I Don't Like Mondays. On October 23, 1984, he and his then-wife, Paula Yates, were watching that BBC report on the Ethiopian famine and decided to raise money to help with relief efforts. Bob got on the phone and called his friend Midge Ure from the group Ultravox. Together, they wrote a song. To be honest, it's not exactly the best written song. The lyrics were a bit cheesy, let's be real. But that wasn't the point of the song. Bob and Midge got together a bunch of their famous friends, and on November 25th and 26th, 1984, a group of artists got together at Sarm West Studio in Notting Hill, London, England. All the artists gave their time, they brought their own food, and recorded a charity single called Do They Know It's Christmas? The group was a who's who of the British music scene at that point. Artists like Bono, George Michael, Paul Young, Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Status Quo, and Sting were recruited. Phil Collins showed up with his drum kit. Boy George flew over from America on the Concorde jet just to sing on this track. America was represented as well, as Kool and the Gang were in town, and since they were on the same record label as Geldof's group, the Boomtown Rats, Kool and the Gang got the invite. The intro to the song, by the way, is a drum sample from the Tears for Fears song, The Hurting. Do They Know It's Christmas was released on December 7th, 1984, and went on to become one of the top 5 biggest-selling singles of all time, raising over $8 million for famine relief. The time frame from the BBC report being shown to the song coming out was right around 5 weeks. The song also inspired USA for Africa's We Are the World, written by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, along with Live Aid, Farm Aid, Hands Across America, and virtually every other charity song in concert ever since. Do They Know It's Christmas has been covered 8 different times, including in 2024 with Band Aid 40. Yes, kids, it's already been 40 years. Feel old. The recording of Band Aid's charity Christmas classic, Do They Know It's Christmas, on November 25th and 26th, 1984. Back in the late 1960s, while in art college, young Farouk Bulsara became friends with bassist Tim Staffel, who was in a band called Smile at the time. Farouk became a fan of the band and ended up joining them when Staffel left the band to form another band. Farouk joined the band and did 2 name changes. The first was that he persuaded the rest of the members of the band, guitarist Brian May and drummer Roger Taylor, to change their name from Smile to Queen. The second was that Farouk Bulsara changed his name to Freddie Mercury. Queen played with different bassists for a couple of years until they found the perfect bassist in John Deacon. In 1973, the band signed a record deal and released their debut album, Queen. The critics liked the progressive metal sound of the band, but the public didn't find the album, even with its now well-known lead single from that album, Keep Yourself Alive. Their second album, Queen 2, found success, both with the critics and the general public. That album had the now classic 7 Seas of Rye on it. In 1974, the band released Sheer Heart Attack, which gave them even bigger success with songs like Killer Queen, Now I'm Here, and Stone Cold Crazy. Album number 4 came around in 1975. A Night at the Opera became a worldwide smash. The album had the hits Love of My Life, You're My Best Friend, and, of course, Bohemian Rhapsody. In the 1980s, the group Queen ruled the charts. They had developed their music and concert performance into a heavyweight show that could not be missed, led by Brian and Freddie. In 1986, they had gone on their kind of magic tour. That's the tour that gave us the Queen Live at Wembley concert film that you may have seen a time or two. The band decided to work on some side projects and then get back together to record their next album, The Miracle. And it was during this time that things began to change. Someone leaked to the press that Freddie Mercury had an HIV test done. Freddie denied to the press that he had had one done, a habit that would continue for the next few years until it can no longer be denied. Freddie was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in 1987. At the time, HIV and AIDS were unknown and misunderstood diseases, extremely misunderstood. They carried a huge stigma and were seen by a lot of people, especially Christian conservatives, as being God's quote-unquote punishment for gay people and drug users, two groups who were perceived by many ultra-religious people as having the most cases of AIDS and deserving of those cases. It made sense at the time that in order to maintain his privacy, that he would deny having AIDS, despite an extremely ruthless British press hounding him and also former lovers outing him. By the time the album The Miracle came out, Freddie's appearance had changed. He began looking frail. The group decided to push on, even though they couldn't do any tours or make many public appearances. That came with the album Innuendo that came out right during that time. During the making of that album, the effects from the virus were beginning to take hold. Freddie could only work on the album an hour or two at a time. Two songs that were very poignant at that time on the album were The Show Must Go On and These Are the Days of Our Lives. When you listen to those lyrics, you realize that Freddie knew that his end was near, and it was his way of saying goodbye. The band wanted to release the album by Christmas of 1990, but couldn't make the deadline due to Freddie's worsening condition. Finally, the album came out in early 1991. When they made the music video for These Are the Days of Our Lives, they put it in black and white in order to minimize just how sick Freddie really was. On November 23, 1991, while Freddie was on his deathbed, the band put out a press release announcing that Freddie had the AIDS virus. The band, close friends, and family kept watch over Freddie. And it was unfortunately when Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five, a close friend of Freddie's, was watching over him that Freddie Mercury passed away on November 24th, 1991, one day after the press release announcing that he had the AIDS virus. The world has not seen a frontman who combined charisma, showmanship, and a powerful voice like his ever since, and Freddie is still missed to this very day. The announcement that Freddie Mercury contracted the AIDS virus on November 23rd, 1991, followed by the death of Freddie Mercury on November 24th, 1991. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for November 20th through the 26th. Thank you very, very much for listening, and if you're on YouTube or Spotify, for watching the video.